Hi everyone, my name is Olivia Matulka and I'm going to be presenting on the Goiania nuclear accident. So the purpose of this presentation will be to inform the viewer of the Goiania nuclear accident, which is also known as Brazil's version of Chernobyl. And the other objective of this presentation is for the viewer to understand the repercussions of this incident as a public health crisis. As a quick overview of the presentation, first I will be discussing a description of the source, and then I will be discussing the dispersal of cesium-137, a background on cesium-137, and then lastly I will be reviewing the health outcomes of this incident. So let's first discuss where exactly this incident occurred. It occurred in Goiania, Brazil, which is the 11th largest city in Brazil, located approximately 202 kilometers away from the capital, Brasilia. Among environmental professionals, it's also home to one of the biggest and most well-known radiotherapy public health disasters. Now let's describe how did this incident occur. In 1985, the Goiania Institute of Radiotherapy moved locations. In doing so, it left behind a cesium-137 containing teletherapy unit in its headquarters. The institute failed to inform the authorities of this existence, and the device sat there for over a year. You can see in the bottom right-hand corner of the presentation, there's a depiction of the teletherapy unit. In the center, there is a blue center with the cesium-137 radioactive agent. Then later, in 1987, two men stole the radiation therapy device from the abandoned clinic. They removed the radioactive cesium-137 from its lead casing and took the glowing blue powder home, leaving them with severe burns. This is shown in the first three images of the schematic. A few days later, they sold the scraps to a junkyard, as shown in images 4 and 5. The junkyard owner was also fascinated by the glowing blue powder. He had friends and relatives come to observe it in the following days, some even taking fragments home, one of which was a 6-year-old girl who was handling the blue powder directly. A few days later, many complained of gastrointestinal issues shortly after. And after a few more days, doctors soon found that many were suffering from acute radiation poisoning. And in total, 249 people had detectable exposure to radiation. 4 people died from radiation, one of whom being the 6-year-old girl. So now I want to go ahead and explore and elaborate on the background of cesium-137 and explain why it was so detrimental. So it's commonly used in radiation therapy to treat cancer. However, if used incorrectly, it can cause burns, acute radiation sickness, increased risk of cancer, and even death. All of these were symptoms in which the residents of Goiania experienced. It's also produced by nuclear fission for use in medical devices, similarly to how it was used in the radiotherapy device left behind. And for comparison, in this slide, I wanted to compare the half-life of other common fissure products. So if we look in the bar graph to the left, we see that cesium-137 its half-life is compared to other common fissure products that can be commonly used in radiotherapy devices. However, cesium-137 has the highest half-life. And then if we compare in the line graph to the right, we also see that it has a half-life of approximately 31 years. Cesium-137 has a moderately high half-life in comparison and a high energy decay. So due to these properties, it's a major contributor to total radiation during nuclear accidents. Next, I want to discuss the outcomes for the 46 most contaminated residents of Goiania. So if we look at the bar graph, we see that if a patient was in contact with relatively low levels of cesium-137, they were most likely an outpatient. They didn't have to go to the hospital, however, they did experience a lot of symptoms. But we do see that as the radiation dose increases, it's more likely that an individual were to die in hospital or have to be hospitalized. They did see that several people survived high doses of radiation, and this was actually thought to be because the dose was fractionated. So the body's repair mechanisms will actually reverse cell damage caused by radiation. If the dose is spread over a long period of time, these mechanisms can mitigate the effects of radiation poisoning. However, as the chart above shows, those that had a high dose of cesium radiation died in hospital, one of which being the 6-year-old girl mentioned earlier. More than 100,000 people in the city had to be monitored for contamination. That's 10% of Goiania's population. More than 40 homes in the city were found to have high levels of contamination, and they were demolished. The topsoil was removed in the surrounding areas as a cleanup process. Not only that, the citizens suffered psychologically, and many other cities shunned the people and products from Goiania following the incident for fear of radiation. Next, I want to just discuss this quote that I found from a Goiania resident from a podcast. In it, she says, "It was not their fault, they didn't know, but perhaps some blame must rest on our society, which allows a low class of people to scavenge to survive." I thought this quote was interesting because it shows that not only was this a public health crisis and an environmental health crisis, it also revealed a lot of class inequalities that were in place that allowed this incident to occur. Two men scavenging for scrap metal, just looking for some extra cash, unwittingly started off a chain of events that killed 4 people, including a little girl. This required a massive cleanup operation. The Goiania incident, which happened without any criminal intent of dispersing radioactive material, surprised the local and the federal authorities of Brazil. No one could have predicted the magnitude of the radioactive contamination, or could they have predicted the impact on health and the environment. And as a last final summary of events, and just to demonstrate how quick in succession this incident occurred, I just wanted to go through a quick timeline. In September of 1985, the Goiania Institute of Radiotherapy moved locations. Approximately 2 years later, in September of 1987, the cesium-137 containing device was sold to a local junkyard. And then approximately a few days later, in 1987, the cesium-137 glowing powder was distributed to multiple people, and radioactive poisoning had ensued. This was a nuclear accident of massive proportions and still affects the Goiania population to this day. Thank you.